All right, so first things first, today is Canada Day, so happy Canada Day to every Canadian who is proud to be a Canadian. And it being Canada Day means that I've had kids all day at home because camp and daycare was closed. So I was not able to get a fully edited vlog out today. So it's a talkie vlog, and people were asking me what I thought about the Trump company indictment and the indictment of Barry Weisselberg. All right. Well, I've read the indictment, and it is a 15-count indictment of fraud, conspiracy, grand larceny, and it's an indictment that typically, ordinarily, as far as my limited experience as an attorney goes, might have resulted in any ordinary apolitical person being reassessed, ordered to pay back taxes and penalties. The fact that it resulted in a 15-count indictment by a grand jury led by two Democratic prosecutors, Cy Vance and Letitia James, it can cause one to ask some questions as to whether or not this is a politically motivated prosecution. I wear this shirt virtually daily because it is true. Politics ruins everything, from music to comedy to science to politics. Politics ruins politics. I've read this indictment. It definitely seems like there are some fishy things going on in the indictment. And for anybody who doesn't know, Barry Weisselberg is an executive within the Trump organizations. You have your Trump organization. Then you have your the Trump entities, various Trump entities, all intertwined. Barry Weisselberg is an executive there, and he draws a salary. And apparently, according to this indictment, he drew a number of fringe benefits that ought to have been counted as salary. A residence in New York, garage, property like televisions, things that were purchased for him that, in theory, could or should or ought to have been declared as salary or taxable benefits. Payment to his children or grandchildren's private schools paid for by the Trump organizations, not declared as salary or fringe benefits or employment benefits by Barry, which would have been taxable and ought to have been declared. And so, according to the indictment, in addition to having received something like $900,000 in taxable or what would have otherwise been taxable benefits, Barry also claimed repayments to which he was not entitled. So yeah, looking at it, some things seem a little suspicious. Some things seems a little difficult to defend, but things that as a lawyer you will see often in the practice where companies want to get away with as much expenses as they can possibly incur, and sometimes that overlaps with what should otherwise be taxable income or benefits on behalf of the employee that they are incurring these expenses for. Some things like an apartment. People are harping on Barry Weisselberg having a New York apartment that was paid for by the Trump org, whereas he declared residence in another state up until a certain point. You know, when you are paying for the apartment of an employee who's using that apartment for work, it is conceivable that that is in fact a legitimate business expense and not a taxable employment expense from the individual if they are in fact using that residence or that property to do work. Same thing goes for garage and other perks. But where it gets a little bit more nebulous, for lack of a better word, children's and grandchildren's private schooling. Being paid for by the Trump organization. And apparently, according to the indictment, there are two sets of books. There was the unofficial books within the organization that kept track of the benefits that the Trump orgs were procuring for Weisselberg that were not being declared on his W-2 forms as employment benefits. It'll all come out in the wash. But typically, these types of issues are in fact resolved more so by civil IRS reassessment and paying back taxes and penalties on what ought to have been declared for income in the previous years, and not by way of 15-count indictment. A funny thing that some people may not know about this entire situation is that apparently all of this case, first of all, it was the product of years of investigating into the Trump orgs. And, Trump supporters might say, after years of investigating thousands and thousands of documents of the Trump orgs, this is the best they got. Whereas, the Trump haters are going to say, after years of investigating, this is the affirmation that the Trump orgs are crooked entities. Play politics with the information the way you want, but doesn't change the nature of the information. After years of investigating, this is what they've got. And why did they get it? It would seem that Barry has been brought down by his ex-wife, Jen, who apparently, according to many reports, was key in this investigation and was key into this investigation getting to where it went to, because apparently she provided troves of tax information and other information, documentation, that allowed for the prosecution or indictment of her ex-husband, which is, I guess, the last revenge of a bitter divorce, I guess. But so you'll see, and apparently in the divorce, in Barry's divorce with Jen, he may or may not have been not disclosing the existence of assets to Jen or income to Jen, which presumably would have had to have been split or shared or, split up in the divorce, or support would have been determined based on assets. So in bitter divorces, spouses have the tendency of downplaying or concealing assets and income so that whatever they split or whatever they have to pay is based on less value. Family law is a dirty industry. Law is a dirty industry, and it would seem the prosecution or persecution of these types of issues is also a dirty industry, because whereas ordinarily this would probably have been resolved civilly by way of back taxes and penalties after you get reassessed and they determine what benefits ought to have been declared versus which ones are justifiable by the business. That's how it typically goes. So why might politically motivated prosecutors go with a 15-count indictment against the Trump orgs and Barry Weisselberg? Well, sometimes being indicted is a bad thing. And by sometimes, I mean all the time. And by indicting, just by the mere fact of indicting Barry and indicting the Trump orgs, it can cause them some serious business and financial problems. Banks don't necessarily want to lend money to people who have been indicted. Banks sometimes have provisions in loan agreements that allow for the immediate recall of loans in the event of a criminal indictment, even if it ends up with an exoneration. So there is some very, very serious problems that can be caused merely by virtue of the fact that an individual and an organization gets indicted. So perhaps if one were to adopt the time-tested and true maxim that politics ruins everything, and one were to look for political motivation as to why this would have gone the route of a 15-count indictment by a grand jury as opposed to a reassessment, back taxes and penalties, because, by the way, they might still be able to do that in any event. So, why not go for both if you can go for both? But why it might have gone the route of the 15-count indictment, this can seriously mess with Barry Weisselberg's ability to continue doing business, and it can cause some serious problems, in theory, for the Trump orgs if they start having loans called for by the banks because they are now under criminal indictment. That is what one could potentially, hypothetically contemplate if one wanted to maybe be open-minded to the fact that this might be a politically motivated prosecution indictment. And again, this is not to normalize any potential criminal behavior. This is sort of the same thing with the Build the Wall indictment, and I did a vlog on that, and I said, yeah, I've had my experience with charities that, push the limits in terms of soliciting donations and personal expenses being paid for by the principals out of the charities. I've had my experience with that as an attorney. And I've seen in the realm of politics, I've seen which charities have the full force of the prosecution and the full force of the law thrust down on them like Thor's hammer or that Marvel guy with the fist. I haven't seen either of these movies. I'm just trying to be cool. But I've seen how the prosecution comes down full force on We Build the Wall and Barry Weisselberg and the Trump orgs, and seemingly does not come down with the same full force on other charities or other business entities that adopt the exact same business practices. So this is not a question of normalizing criminal conduct. This is a question of trying to normalize the prosecutorial process, which itself seems to be politicized and weaponized beyond any form of recognition. That is the indictment. I'm going to discuss it with Robert Barnes on Sunday because he has a lot more tax law experience than I do. And by a lot more, I have minimal. I did quite a bit of bankruptcy law, and these issues come up in bankruptcy law. But I'm going to defer to Robert's assessment, but, ask him the questions that I'm asking myself in terms of whether or not this is politically motivated, whether or not there are some legitimate gripes, legitimate accusations in that indictment. But that is the breakdown. Talk about it Sunday night with Robert. If you want to support the channel, you know where to support it. The links are in the pinned comment, and links to merch are in the pinned comment. You can also support Robert Barnes and I on Locals. It is vivabarneslaw.locals.com. All of my content is also on Rumble for anybody who wants to watch it there. But more important than any of that, take care of yourselves, check in on friends and family, make sure everyone around you is doing well, and now you know your vlog. Peace out.